We are here for Switzerland. Here, where life is full of energy, and there, where everything remains the same. Electricity has been there for us for a long time, and we are there for electricity. We are here when it comes to our future. We keep at it, are full of energy, making sure that Switzerland stays on the move.
Ich sehe, es sind eigentlich alle im Raum.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. As I can see, most of you are in here. I'll give you a bit more time to take your seats.
J'espère encore les mêmes. Und dann würden wir dann in Teil 2 eines sehr spannungsvollen...
Gentlemen, let us start with the second part of our dense program. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. And those of us joining us from home, I hope are able to say the same. Let's start with the second part of this year's Grid Forum. We are going to talk different issues. At the start, we're going to talk about something that concerns all industries. Digitalization is linked to cyber risks and cyber security, and this is particularly true for your industry. We're going to take a closer look at cyber security now, and I hope I'm not spoiling it for you now if I tell you that we're going to start with a life hack. We're going to show you what's possible if some people with evil intentions get to work. A lot is possible, unfortunately, I might say, and it might be good to take a look what is possible and how that concerns you. Cyril Brunschweder is Managing Director of Compass Security, and he's going to demonstrate what's possible in this field. I don't know what to wish for it to work or not to work. I don't know. However that may be, welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I think we are talking about an important issue. I hope to be able to show you in my presentation what is needed for safe infrastructure in the future. I'm Cyril Brunschwiller, Managing Director of Compass Security. We employ hackers that break into systems. This is probably how you imagine a cyber attack being carried out. This is a picture of the European Cybersecurity Challenge. At the end of September, the finals are taking place in Vienna. European nations select a total of 10 teams who are going to compete in Vienna. They have to break codes, they have to break into systems to score points. And at the end, we're going to have a European champion. Not only Europe is participating, the US, Canada, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates are sending teams as well. Hacking is my business. I did not learn that in a garage. I did not learn that in my basement. I studied at university. I studied IT and then specialized in hacking. Let's talk about blackouts. Currently, people talk more about shortages, But I do think there are some physical challenges. If you want to turn the lights out in Switzerland, you do not need to do that via the internet. You could also crash a plane into a substation, as the one in Mettlen, for example. But the problem is that you need to get there to do that, and that is still rather difficult. Therefore, cyber attacks seem a valid option. A lot has moved to the digital sphere, not everything, but a lot. And for things like this not to happen, we have a lot of protective devices that control lines and transformers and other devices. And if they do not work properly, things like this might happen. I've brought one of these devices along. This is Vagro PLC, and Vago CEO came to me and said, "You cannot show these things with one of our devices." So my disclaimer is not up to the device. It could be a Siemens, a Schneider, or an ABB device. It's all about the 61850 protocol that this device is able to carry out. I brought this device along, and I'm going to talk more about it in a minute. If you start up this device, you plug in the Ethernet cables, and then you start naming the circuit breakers, for example, get XCR names, and similar conventions apply in-house. And in the case I showed you beforehand, it would have been better to open a different switch first. How do you attack a substation? Well, there is a connection, there is a control room that can measure and maybe control things. The connection might be a 101 connection, optical waves. There's no encryption. That's obviously risky. Today a lot is TCP/IP, and if you don't, as an attacker, you might first attack one substation and then the other. There are some cases where you can look at measurement data from the office, and that might give you access to the SCADA part of a network. Sometimes firewalls are not properly configured. Today, most companies are able to configure their firewalls properly today. Sometimes devices have vulnerabilities that can be exploited. There is a whole host of attacks that are possible. 1 in 4 can be carried out from outside. The other attacks require the attacker to enter these networks. If you want to break into a network, you have different options. If you read the newspaper and you read about a successful attack, it always seems incredibly difficult. More often than not, it was not all that difficult. Malspam is one example. You receive an email that contains a link that invites you to download Trojan, not a document by Swisscom or UPC. Sometimes weak passwords are the problem. We recently had a case where someone logged in as an administrator, had remote access, and the password was the company name. You are laughing, but people are still choosing these passwords. Multi-factor authentication is something that you know from your e-banking. You receive an SMS, you have to enter a PIN code, or you must take a picture of something. This is something that is in place to protect you. If you lose a password and someone finds it, that does not give him access to your network. There are some online tools that do collect passwords from these breaches that do happen. Let me enter my email address to give you an example.
Also wir könnten auch die E-Mail-Adresse vom Swissgrid CEO eingeben. So.
We could maybe use the Swissgrid CEO email address. This email address was never found in a password leak, but I have an old address. That's not so good, is it? You may then scroll down and you can actually find out where your password was lost. In October 2013, Adobe lost 153 million accounts. Adobe does know how security works, and still their security was breached. What does an attacker do with that email address? You do have to use different passwords for every login, or do you? So maybe that break-in won't work, but attackers might use one password for gaining access to other networks. And obviously, this is something an attacker will try, and this is how these breaches and attacks happen. And it's not my fault. It's Adobe's fault. But the problem is, if people use the accounts outside of their business, the risk spreads. The protection of your password is only as good as the worst website it was used on. And that might pose certain problems. We had a case from the machine building industry. They do send out a machine once it has been paid, and the client called them and said, "Where is my machine?" And the supplier says, "Well, I don't know. The machine production hasn't started yet. Why did he think he should have received one?" And we then found out that the client account appeared in a leak. The attackers gained access to the online email account. They saw the order, wrote to him that the machine was ready and the bank was under maintenance, and gave different bank details. And 150,000 were transferred, but the machine hadn't been built yet. As easy as that. With two-factor authentication, this would not have been possible, because this would have stopped the attacker, or would have at least made it more difficult for the attacker. Devices exposed to the internet are not patched quickly enough. People often tell us, well, we have to test first and we shall apply the patches in a week's time. That's too slow. What does an attacker do? If you get a security update, the attackers get the same update. They look at the old version, they look at the new version, and they put them on top of each other, and they know where the problem is. Within minutes, they do. And that's why Microsoft includes features that are not security relevant in their updates to make it more difficult to find the vulnerabilities. If you wait for a week, your attackers have found a way to use that vulnerability. It takes them hours, not weeks, actually.
Ja gut, also wenn man das grafisch ein bisschen visualisiert.
Okay, so if we want to visualize that then, an attacker can simply ask politely for a password, and then if that is provided, they can log in and use this data to access all kinds of other data. And then there's the option with the USB stick left in a parking lot, for example, or in a goldfish bowl, say, left hanging around as an advertising gift. That's also very effective.
Nicht so spannend, da eben man sich quasi in die Schweiz begeben muss.
It all depends whether or not you need to be on site to do these things. Then there could be various codes entered. That was the case in the Ukraine, where an email was received with an attachment, and the employee received this attachment and also replied to the email. So it's not necessarily the case that the attacker can communicate into the company. Firewalls are pretty sophisticated by now. Most companies cannot be penetrated from the outside. However, once attackers are inside of the company, they can access all kinds of things. They can surf the internet, for instance. They can email from inside the company, outside of the company, and then via that they will be able to access inside the company from elsewhere. And these covered channels, so they create a tunnel through the protocols that are in place. And from outside towards the inside of the company, that will be permitted by the firewall because it is something that is required to perform business operations, in theory. So Trojan horses then gather information from these systems, from an attacker, and if the attacker says, send this information out to me, the horse will get the information from the system and process that there, run any kind of protocols and send the results back out to the attacker. And if that is the case, if a weakness has been exploited, then usually there is a next step, in that the user is not the end game. They would like to become administrators because only administrators can access things that are interesting to hackers. Now, what this means then for operators of critical infrastructure, this might not be so much about documents that are confidential or anything like that, but instead it is about the infrastructure itself, the equipment. And there was a case where it was air-gapped, and nonetheless there was an issue. I'm not sure whether all grid operators are air-gapped. Now, the way this works is if you want to have a look at something, if you need to change something, configure something, the technician will access this remotely and do whatever is required from afar, because you don't want to have to get up at 2 in the morning and go to the end of the earth to fix something. Nobody's up for that. And so much of this is done remotely. Now, the attackers design their attacks. LinkedIn, Xing, all of these social networks are leveraged. When we launch an attack, we ask what certifications does the IT employee in this organization have. Then we'll know what they are able to do, what they are likely to have done, and we'll know how to circumvent that because we know what their qualifications actually entail. And so we might find that the most effective way is to attack the technician directly, and that's something we would see on LinkedIn, say. The CFO might be a good person to target if I want information on the finances. If I want personnel information, I'll attack HR, because these are the individuals who already have access rights to certain information. And so if the attacker is in a position to embody somebody in that role, then they automatically have access to all of these things. In a Windows environment, you can achieve a great deal very quickly. And very quickly, you can control all of the systems involved. Sometimes this might take a few hours or half a day. But in scenarios like this, the progression is often extremely quick. The most work is involved in actually breaching the company itself in the first place. So, what could an attacker do? Is there a collection of possible approaches? Well, MITRE put together a compilation, and this is the cyber kill chain, if you like. Let me make it a bit bigger so that you can see it. I mean, there's just a lot of tiny details so far. So, looking at this matrix then, you can see how an attack works. Essentially, all of the activities attackers can pursue are categorized here. If in the industry a new attack has to be investigated, what happens is that the information is entered into here. So attacks on Ukraine, the US, etc. All of this information has been incorporated into this overview. This entails information on how attackers proceeded, the tools that they used, the scripts that were implemented. And reconnaissance is essentially the attacker finds out what the company is about, who administrates the company, who has the required access rights. Then the required jargon is put together before initial access is attempted. Now, when initial access has been achieved, it'd be good if we could scroll through this. So, first foot in the door, then a code is executed. The idea then is to achieve persistence. The attacker wants to be able to control the computer even if it is rebooted. And so the attacker will attempt to gain administrator status. The antivirus environment will be investigated because these defenses will have to be overcome as well. The attacker will attempt to steal credentials. Anybody who has an Excel sheet of usernames and passwords, they'll scoop that up. Then they'll have a little bit of a look around, discover what it is that they can find. Then they'll start to move from system to system so that they can enter zones that aren't as easy to reach. Collecting information, stealing data. There's the command and control channel where the entire infrastructure can be observed. There's exfiltration and impact. So this is the procedure that each attack follows. And of course, if an attack is hyper advanced, you can't know whether this what details were involved, but essentially this is the procedure and it's always the same. And clearly some attackers are better than others, but the basic principle remains the same, and so we know what it is that people are doing. So if I put in Sandworm then, that's the threat actor, the group that did the hacking we were talking about in Ukraine, and that's categorized, and there have been various companies having their say here, and everybody tries to claim that they have named this correctly. The bears are basically always the Russians, the pandas are generally Chinese, entertaining, is it not? But it's not really funny, is it, though? This is very serious indeed. It is something that happens in real life. And so you can have a bit of a look at what they've done in the past. They look for particular email accounts, they manipulate accounts, try to gain authorization over different equipment, to access different weak points. If you're already internal, because there's fewer patches involved than if you're accessing everything from outside of a company, standard passwords, all of these things, the list goes on and on. Very long list. So when you see a new attack, you try to find out which group this was, but that in itself is a skill in its own right. It's extremely time-consuming. You can also search for software components, for instance, black energy. And black energy was used in the attack in Ukraine. And black energy was built by the Sandworm team. And that falls under Russian intelligence, in theory. In 2020, the FBI was involved. There was a reward offered to find members of the group. So a great deal of money being offered at the time. And as far as I'm aware, there have been no results from this just yet. So everybody knows who this was, and nonetheless, we're in the dark. So black energy then, this malware that was used, it can do various things. It can go via the web protocol to communicate. It needs the channel, the same channel that you use to, say, consult Google. So it nests in those environments. And so every time it started anew, black energy is started anew too. This is how they steal passwords, etc., etc. And it's very easy to see everything that has happened here. It's all listed. Now, companies that are well equipped in detecting these kinds of things can take this kind of matrix and check their own systems to see whether it is possible to do that. Now, it's a great deal to do, and certainly certain things may be missed, but it does help to highlight any blind spots. And that is how the detection of those weak spots can be improved. Okay, so you've listened to me for a fair while now. I've just been talking about the attack in 2015, and what was the case at that time was that was in the southwest of Ukraine. Around 230,000 households were cut off from the electricity supply, some for an hour, others for 6 hours. That was roughly the range. That's not necessarily something that is hugely damaging to the grid itself, but the extent of the damage that can be done with simply trivial attacks of this kind, that was new at that time. And surprisingly, procedure hasn't particularly changed since then. So if we have a look, there was a phishing email with a Word macro. So the macro language in Word is such that you can automate certain things. At the top, maybe a little yellow bar pops up. I'm not sure if you've seen this before in the past, but yellow essentially means warning, and nonetheless, there are people who click the yellow bar. And that is how the Trojan horse was activated. Their usernames, passwords were stolen. With these usernames and passwords, they were able to log in to the infrastructure as if they were a regular employee and were able to analyze the network. Then for a certain time, nothing really happened. Then they came back, and in the meantime, they had developed firmware for protocol translators. So depending on whatever you're working on, you need firmware to a certain extent. They developed malicious firmware, and that implementation then was rendered unable to function. So they went in via the HDMI. Any technician can do this really if they are so inclined, and operated breakers. Then the UPS were shut down. The broken firmware was uploaded and logs and disks deleted using a kill disk. And it was just all wiped. The level of destruction was quite considerable. But this was a great deal of manual work. And when it came down to it, the hotline then was issuing denial of service. People were asking you when things would be up and running again, when the electricity would be back. And of course, if there's no electricity, it would be good if you were able to make phone calls. So, I have brought this device along with me because this 61850 device is what you can see all the way on the right-hand side. So in your infrastructure, that's it, in a dusty corner somewhere. Nobody really wants to go there. Of course, the technician visits from time to time. Perhaps configuration has to be done. Although there are blocks on the configuration, they're mostly turned off because then you have to literally go up to the machine on foot to configure it manually, and really Zurich to Graubünden just to configure this thing. We've covered that topic already. So then you just have to have a stick plugged in. I've got two examples for you today. This is the first. Passwords, that's not always the easiest thing. Okay, let's have a look. So, now, you have to imagine the hacker is online. They basically access this via the internet. There's a certain connection. We saw this in the visual before. Then you have the technician. He or she has this overview, an Omicron tool, and you can change certain things here. It would be good if I was able to do it for you just now.
So.
There we go.
Jetzt,
right. Now, I've sent a document to the machine, a very important document. And the technician is about to look at this document.
Genau, er hat diese Referenz da bekommen, dieses PowerPoint.
So the technician has received this reference, this PowerPoint document. I'm just going to open that now.
Ja, es ist irgendwie kaputt. He?
It seems to be a bit broken, huh? Oh dear.
Ja, was ist dann da passiert?
Well, what's happened? Something has happened. It doesn't look the same as it did before. Perhaps you've noticed this.
Also wenn man da muss das noch ein
So
bisschen
if you have a look here, let me make this a bit smaller for you, otherwise you won't be able to see.
Also ich hänge jetzt, das ist noch ein altes System.
So this is an old system. It works on newer systems too, no problem.
Kann auch schauen, welcher Benutzer. Ich bin
You
dort
can
der
also
Benutzer.
have a look at the user compass. So essentially, I'm the technician at this point, and then you can do whatever you like, really. Once you're on the computer itself, you've been able to infiltrate it. You can put in data text like this, or start notepad, or open the particular file. So what happens then?
Ja. Irgendwie ist
What's
leid.
happening? Not a great deal, it seems. Maybe the screen is broken. But what I can do is check. You should have been able to see the document at this point. But if I head on out of there just now,
Dann habe ich die
Then-
Möglichkeit, verschiedene Kommandos auszuführen.
here, I can enter various commands.
Ich kann da mal beginnen,
I could start with
eine Route zu setzen. Und zwar
a
ist es
route,
ja so,
like
dass
this.
der Angreifer jetzt eben Kontakt hat zum Techniker.
The hacker is in contact with the technician at this point, and that is hooked up to the internet and also online within the company. And now, what the hacker can do is, in effect, act as if he or she was on the technician's computer. And then it's possible to see what kind of systems are available.
Und dieser Portscan, den habe
The port scans does this.
das dauert so.
And I've shortened this a little bit because otherwise it would take a few minutes or a few hours. But essentially, this is what the hackers did in Ukraine. They basically looked around to see what other systems were available, and then it identified this piece of equipment. And because I have information on this equipment, I can basically have a virtual representation of this machine on my device. And I'll show you this afterwards.
Schnell schauen.
Let's just have a quick look. Just a moment, please.
Gut, mal schauen, ob jetzt das geht.
All right, let's see if it's worked.
Kann ich da dieses Gerät lokal
What I can do is do this locally. I have a few tools.
Ich rede jetzt mit dieser Vago, als wäre sie bei mir lokal installiert.
So I'm interacting with this Vago as if I was on site with it, essentially. I've picked out the logical nodes, the IOs, I see the pink single point controllables. And so as an attacker, at this point, I'm not entirely sure how the equipment works, so perhaps it would be good to steal a few documents from the company so that I know how it works. But once this is done, I can then
So machen.
do that.
Und das habe ich alles über den Angreifer gemacht.
And I've done all of that as if I was the hacker. So the tools, years ago, I would have had to put those together myself because they weren't simply available. But there, of course, there has been progress made in the interim. And this project really means that good things can be done with it. There are two sides to it, really, because at the same time, it can be used as a weapon. You can buy an excellent knife in Migros and you can use it to perfectly slice meat, or you can use it to do harm. And that's really the same when it comes to tools used by technicians. They can be very useful, but also can do an awful lot of damage.
Wir haben quasi dieses trojanische Pferd auf den Computer
So the Trojan horse
Technikers gebracht. Und das kann auch über
was put onto the technician's computer. It might be via an email or whatever, the channels that we can use. So there is then a channel open. I created a tunnel to the system once I had found it and had access to the equipment locally. That's it.
Dafür muss ich dann eben nicht
And that doesn't require me to tap into the central whatever. No, I can do it, well, from here. So what do you do then if this has happened?
eine lustige Folie, ich habe die hier kopiert, das ist von einem Nord.
I've included a slide here from a Norwegian incident responder.
In Norwegen für den Bund unterwegs, aber auch für
Work for the government in Norway, but also for the counterpart to Swisscom. And
da schauen, links
investigations were conducted into this, and there were certain examples where the hackers wanted a lot of money very quickly. And of course, if somebody's asking for money, you know pretty quickly that you've been hacked. So people are suddenly present and want your money. Now, if this is more advanced, more persistent, when an advanced hacker is involved, this is rarely about money. I don't believe that the situation in Kiev was such that it was about money. I believe that the end game was really to turn the lights out and to be in control of this kind of thing in the future too. So they approached this then, infiltrated the infrastructure and started to build in various back doors so that if one back door was found and overcome, there would be backup back doors. So what you can then do, even if the grid is, well, off the grid, not a great deal will happen. You'll be able to continue to work. However, if you're in the kind of situation, as on the right-hand side, where this is a great deal more complicated, if you are the provider, say, this becomes a lot more difficult and it becomes a lot harder to get to the root of the hack. And it's a lot harder to overcome it and really ensure that the problem is overcome. So what do we need to do to stop this from happening? I think there is a great deal that can be done of a preventive kind. And there are a few principles here, and you might roll your eyes, but look, these are the technical recommendations. Of course, there are organisational recommendations, things as regards processes. That's not my area of expertise. I'm sure they are just as important, but from a technical perspective, there are things where it's simply not enough. The recommendations here are not enough. So here, for instance, it says laptops, portable, parameterizing or remote control PCs and handheld devices should be strictly secured. Should be. Should be is not enough. You know, if you have attacks like these, you have to be secured. If you're not secured, that's just not okay. You know, otherwise, email access, all of these things that be consulted and parameterized, and it would only be a matter of time before the whole thing blow up. You know, we have seen this in other companies, and this industry is no different to any other company. It will happen if we continue on this route. Remote access. Access to jump stations, that's server systems that are in special networks where you first have to connect up before you can control anything. These should take place by means of two-factor authentication. And I explained to you how that worked with two-factor authentication. If you don't have it in place, it is very, very easy to overcome. It shouldn't say should be, it should say they have to. They have to have two-factor authentication. Now, perhaps it's a little difficult to conduct controls, if you like, in an area that isn't necessarily commonplace for most people. But there are things that have to be done better, and essentially better than in the guidelines. Because, you know, these are things that I have mentioned to even, tax advisors or whatever. Whenever you have contact information that is accessible by other people, you have a vulnerability. And in many instances, a great deal of trouble could have been avoided by investing, say, 2 to 3 francs a month. We could be better protected. I believe we still have a great deal left to do. Oh, it seems we've got a blackout going on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Cyril Brunschwiller, vielen herzlichen Dank.
Cyril Brunschwiller, thank you very much. Let's ask a couple more questions. Some questions were asked by our audience I think you've really talked about something that concerns us in our daily work. Let me just pick out one thing. What are the biggest vulnerabilities Swiss businesses face? What's your recommendation? You talked about usernames, passwords, and so on, two-factor authentication. Yes, I think I've given some recommendations. You all have your virus scanners. Systems are being updated automatically, but your access credentials are getting more and more important. Cloud services are becoming part of the IT infrastructure, and it's important to keep on top of things. In the past, if you had no access to the office, you could not use the IT. If the stuff's in the cloud, you can use it from anywhere. And if then the processes are not clear-cut and the accounts are being closed, then that leads to problems. Account management is an issue. Patching is another one. Malware is always a difficult one. The example I showed you is detected by virus scanners. We practiced with federal authority where we got around the best-in-class protective solutions. We build up an infrastructure that looks similar and keep repeating that build-up until we manage to bypass security. And in infrastructure, we're playing that ball game. We're not talking about accidentally opening email attachments, and you need to train your staff, and they need to come up to you and report anything strange they recognize. Obviously, security can be a boring issue, but it's something that must be part and parcel of each and every process. We received another question. Someone asked, is physical security not more important than cyber security, especially when it comes to infrastructure? Yes, when talking about power, when talking about electricity, this is something we mustn't forget, obviously. Obviously, I know that if you throw a spanner in the works, physically, that messes things up. Same is true for a plane crashing into infrastructure. The question is, what can we do? Not a lot is the answer. But I think cyber bears the additional risk that these attacks can be carried out from anywhere in the world. And that increases the risk. Maybe one more question that I can take to the panel refers to a study from last summer. The question is, where do we currently stand? There was talk today about a cyber authority from the federal prosecutor. We have Melanie, where you can report cyber incidents. We all know Melanie. Where does Switzerland stand? Are we in a good position? As an expert, you probably say we could do more. Where do we stand? Well, cybersecurity is not a sovereign task. We are all entrepreneurs, and we have to look after our people and after our businesses. Yes, the state might be able to help, and SC and Melanie are there to help. If we have incidents, we report them to also gain additional information, and I think it works rather well. But we in Switzerland have a federal system, and that sometimes makes things difficult, especially when it comes to policing matters. And then it might be helpful to look beyond the picket fence, so to speak. But then it becomes difficult due to the different legal frameworks. Yes, obviously more could be done. At the end of the day, it comes down to individual responsibility. There is some regulation. More regulation does not always make things better, as we heard this morning. I think we have to be more strict with ourselves. That's my take-home message. Well, you said look beyond the picket fence, look at Europe. What you're expecting from the network code cybersecurity Europe, how does Switzerland fit into that? Well, I haven't looked at that. I cannot say anything about this code. Okay, then that question remains open, and this remains another question to be answered. How does Switzerland fit into this European initiative? The answer will most likely be it depends, and it's rather complicated, as always when it comes to matters of Switzerland and Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Brunschwiller. I think we all learned something about how to protect ourselves against these threats and dangers. At the end of the day, it always starts with the human factor. The machines are not the problem, or are they? Yes, unfortunately, that's true. A lot of things can be done, and the attackers take the simplest way. The weakest link is the human factor. That's your take-home message. Thank you very much for having been here.
Ja, und lassen Sie uns das gleich fortfahren. Thema Digitalisierung, Thema auch Cybersicherheit.
Let's continue to talk about digital security and cyber security. We have some guests who are going to talk here, unless Mr. Brunschwiller decides to switch off everything. I'm watching you. No, let's continue to talk about digitalization. I would like to invite to the stage Konrad Zerst, Head of Technology for Swissgrid, René Kerkmeister, CEO of Equigi. Welcome, René. And last but not least, Peter Kummer, member of the management board of the Swiss Federal Railway and responsible for infrastructure. He has also served as CIO and is familiar with matters of digitalization and cyber security. Let's take a closer look at these issues. Let's start out by a question that I would like to put to all panelists. The organizers said digitalization means a change of attitude. It does not simply mean digitalization existing processes. What does that mean for you and for your business, Mr. Zerst? Well, for us, it does mean that the way we work changes. We do not digitalize a piece of paper. We do not simply turn a piece of paper into a Word document. It's about processes. It's about how we process information. Let's look at Swissgrid. Today we talked about digitalization, and our existing grids do have bottlenecks. We need to use these grids to their best potential until we shall discover other ways to transport energy. Or
transformation is not just going on and maybe add a little thing. How do you deal with that question?
I think for me it's a combination, actually. And this is experience as Chief Digital for TenneT, the Dutch and German transmission system operator. I make often the difference between within the perimeter of your organization and outside. And within the perimeter of your organization, you can try to digitalize some of the processes. And for me, my experience is that most change came out the data. If you have digitalized the process, you have access to data, you gain new insights, and that will trigger the change of processes. For instance, if you know how many failures you had in a certain piece of equipment, you maybe change your maintenance processes or even your spare policies. So the data is the key driver for change, but you use existing processes for starters. If you look outside the perimeter of your organization, you have to look at a whole different context, the way you do business within the context of your environment. Kodak, a famous example, missed the moment of digitalization, the camera. But also in energy. In the past, we had a small group of people, a small number of producers, and it was a very selective way of how we could manage the system. But the world is rapidly changing with the renewables, with electric vehicles. So there's so many changes. And I think you have to look in this context really out of the box. It's umdenken of the way you've done business in the past years. You need complete different digital solutions if you want to still have a relevant role in the future to come.
Dieses Umdenken, das Teil der Digitalisierung. Peter Kummer, wenn ich es richtig gesehen habe, Sie sind
This is part of digitalization, change of attitude. Mr. Kummer, you joined SBB 15 years ago. You witnessed digitalization throughout these 15 years. What does digitalization mean for you? What does it mean for your company? Well, I think the Swiss Federal Railway is now digital. About 70% of our rail tickets are sold digitally. We run trains via 4 control rooms in Switzerland, energy and load management. We ran different projects in Switzerland. Our trains run on time. And in the winter, we do not have enough energy, and we have digital projects. We, for example, have to heat the points and turns. We have to also heat our trains, and every time we have a load peak in the winter, for 2 minutes, we turn these consumers off. In the train, you don't notice, it doesn't suddenly get cold, but that helps us save a lot of energy. To answer your questions, we worked on lots of single projects, but we also worked on our corporate culture and worked on how we do IT, away from projects towards products. And obviously, we continue to update our software. As you said, we all use these projects. Mr. Kerkmeister mentioned data as an important part of digitalization. What does that mean for you? What do you do with this data? Yes, I think data pose a huge challenge. You do need data, and you need good quality data, and this is something we all lack. That requires a lot of hard work. This is something that can not be done overnight, not even in 2 or 3 years' time. It requires a lot of discipline.
For a long time now has been blockchain. I know you've been working quite intensely with blockchain. How can we imagine that in the sector of energy as well?
Yeah. Maybe we can watch a little video before we go into the question. Is it possible to...
Let's do that. Yeah, sure.
See the video?
Can we have a look at the video?
Equigy Crowd Balancing Platform presents a new perspective on the role consumers can play in the energy transition. This is Ariana. She is getting more and more involved in the energy transition because, without knowing it, she's becoming an energy supplier. Let us show you how this works. The energy sector is changing. We see a growing number of new energy sources that generate electricity from wind and sunlight. But the wind may or may not blow, and the sun does not always shine. So how can we ensure that we can respond to an excess demand for electricity or an oversupply on the grid? This is where Ariana comes in. She has invested in solar panels, a heat pump, home battery, and an electric vehicle. These devices can contribute to the balancing challenge on the grid. Ariana's service provider will help her when these devices can be best used. Take her car, for example. After work, she comes home and plugs it into the grid. And while Ariana is preparing dinner, her car is sharing its energy status. Meanwhile, Vincent is monitoring supply and demand. He sees that Ariana's car starts supplying power to help balance the grid. The following morning, Ariana unplugs her car. Her own service provider secures a full battery and compensates Ariana for the energy delivered by her car. So, in fact, Ariana's car makes her the energy supplier, and so does her solar panel, home battery, and heat pump. This way, she contributes to the energy transition and creates some extra revenue for herself. And it's not just Ariana, but millions of other Europeans as well. Together, we are creating a huge new energy storage that enables us to balance the renewable energy supply of the future. Equity Crowd Balancing Platform.
So when I look at that interconnection, I can kind of understand where this is going. But let us approach the blockchain.
Yeah, and before blockchain, so crowd balancing, that is the real purpose. And I would like to reflect a little bit about the sessions this morning. Sonia, who presented the World Climate Report, stating that every little action is needed to help us change, save the planet, basically. So Mark O'Malley later saying, like, we need, I'm not sure how many billion cars to produce 4 times the overall Swiss
2.5, I think.
2.5. Right? That's not what we need. I mean, we did, the European Investment Bank subsidized for us a study by Rambo, and in 2030, 30 to 50% of balancing and congestion management, redispatch energy can be taken out of electric vehicles, of home batteries. So 30 to 50% is significant. There's economic signals at the moment with these high prices that make it economic viable for consumers to participate in this energy transition. So I think we should not waste. We could all say, let's only build grids. I don't think there's a silver bullet. For sure, we need to continue to build grids, but we also need to look at smart grid solutions such as this one. Then back to your question, why blockchain? Mm-hmm. The crowd balancing platform is a distributed solution. So we believe we need distributed technologies to make it happen. We integrate DSOs, TSOs, aggregators, consumers. So why should there one party to run a proprietary database, even in the cloud, to manage this all? So we believe to lock the transaction, you need a distributed technology, and which was the blockchain. So a key part of the crowd balancing platform is designed, enabled by blockchain, but it's not all, because we realize we also need streaming technologies like Kafka. So we're using the Hyperledger, the private blockchain solution, but the crowd balancing platform is much more than that.
Isn't there a dilemma, and we got a question about that as well, that blockchain, as we all know, is quite infamous, has the reputation of needing a lot of energy. How do you kind of balance these two points?
So there's 2 types of blockchains. There's public blockchain, private blockchain. Mm-hmm. And a public blockchain, like the Bitcoin, Ethereum, that's famous for the high energy usage. Mm-hmm. The private blockchain...
Digging, so to speak.
Yeah, digging and all this. The private blockchain is an instrument, is a technology that takes the benefits of the blockchain without this energy problem. Mm-hmm. So it has simplified it, so the energy consumption aspects that you have in the public blockchain does not exist in private blockchain. So that's Hyperledger, it's still open source by Linux Foundation, but you don't have you don't have those problems that you have at the public blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Sind das Themen, die auch Sie beide, ich sage jetzt mal täglich...
Are these issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis? Other questions were asked about blockchain, but also artificial intelligence. In how far does that influence your daily work? No, we currently do not have any use cases for blockchain. AI is something we do spend some time talking about. Obviously, you need data. 80% of AI is good quality data to train your algorithms. And this is something a lot of people do not know, that you have to do the groundwork. And this is something we all have to work on. You need good quality data to use algorithms well. SBB, the Swiss Federal Railway, has a lot of data, so it would be fairly easy for you to use AI on this data. Yes, AI is something that we're working on. Well, our core business is capacity on the rail, optimizing timetables when we have disruptions, and we use AI to do that intelligently. Let me say a few words about blockchain. We have some blockchain cases, but they are very limited. We only make very limited use of this technology, access critical infrastructure, Gotthard Base Tunnel. We must make sure that those entering have the right certificates, but technology is only a small part of that. AI has a lot more potential for us. Let me ask something that concerns SBB and Swissgrid. Could you not link your grids to counteract shortages this winter? Yes, Mr. Kummer, if I may start out on this question, I think there is some confusion. SBB has two grids, 16.7 gigahertz. We have 8 power plants where we produce electricity. Usually we have too much electricity in summer and not enough in winter. We buy about 10% of nuclear power, and this is a problem we're going to face this winter. You're the largest consumer in Switzerland. Yes, we are, but we are also one of the largest producers. But the 50 hertz grid, the normal grid, so to speak, is more problematic, and you can not say let's make SBB self-sufficient via the 16.7 hertz network, because if the 50 hertz network doesn't work, if this grid were to be switched off every once in a while, then we cannot run our trains, because our IT, our communication systems, all of that uses the 50 hertz networks, and that's not self-sufficient. If that breaks down, trains stop running. Obviously, this links to some cybersecurity issues. Mr. Zerschk, there is a study that says certain energy businesses are ill-prepared when it comes to matters of cybersecurity. We're talking about critical infrastructure. A lot is at stake. This study surprised me, almost shocked me. How about you? Well, at the end of the day, the study looked at self-declarations, and the way it was carried out means that it's difficult to draw precise conclusions. We do know that some of the technologies being used are outdated, as has been explained to us by the previous speakers. Patches need to be installed, systems need to be updated. We as an industry have to increase the security, but I would not rate this study too high. It's most certainly an important issue also when it comes to training, when it comes to communications. Mr. Kummer, do you do that? How do you raise awareness? We heard the weakest link is the human factor. We tend to make the same mistakes time and again as member of management, it might be difficult to keep repeating the same things, but how do you do it? Well, you have to walk the talk. We run awareness programs, corporate culture programs that are designed to raise awareness. We run phishing tests that show possible security gaps, but I think at the end of the day you have to work on your security culture and on your mistake culture. You must be able to report mistakes and learn from them, but this is a process that takes a lot of time.
During the pandemic, cybersecurity has been a huge issue, and breaches have been, in Switzerland at least, I think 6 times as many as before. When we look at that topic in general, do we still underestimate it? Do we still have to tell people, look at the risk, look at the danger? We keep talking about it, but people don't seem that affected by it.
Yeah. For us, at least, it's always on the top list of the risk matrix. Yeah. And Cyril just showed us the vulnerability with many devices. But if we really move to an Internet of Energy with so many more devices of electric vehicles, home batteries, I mean, there's even more access points where we're vulnerable. So indeed, from a corporate culture point of view, you need strong policies. It's not only about IT, it's also about identity management, access management, so behavior. But also we have a threat-based approach. So we think, where can we have the biggest threats? How are we protected against those threats? And what changes do we need to do? Mm-hmm. And I recognize when Cyril presented his list, a lot of the threats, the highest that we often see is the perimeter breach, people doing the penetration, the malware, the ransomware. So it's all there. And we also have the social engineering, which is that's more on the financial side, that people say, hey, can you please send us a wire? Is this €100,000 or something? So there's all these aspects that you continuously have to monitor. And I think you can never be doing enough on it. It's a huge risk for all of us, an extreme complex matter.
Wie machen Sie das bei Swissgrid?
How about you at Swissgrid? We heard that you must communicate and that you must walk the talk. We also heard that you can book your own hacker. You do not communicate about this really, but you do work with experts to identify your weaknesses, or do you? Yes, that's part of it, but we also have to create the right framework conditions in your business. Obviously, that means doing what you say. That means protecting the information that you have. That means that the information you need is available, cannot be changed, cannot be deleted. That's the organizational side of it. If you then go one step further and check these systems and run mock attacks, that is useful. We do that, and obviously we do find gaps in our security systems, but it's important for us to find these early on with the help of professional hackers rather than waking up with a problem. What does the Swiss Railway do? Do you also run mock attacks? Yes, most certainly. Obviously, there are processes, information security, management systems. We are certified. We spend a 2-digit million figure on cybersecurity, and obviously we do test and audit our access systems. Maybe one last question, something that was mentioned this morning. We looked at the horse and cart and heard that digitalization and the laws of physics do not always work well together. Now, you represent digitalization on this panel. What's your view? Have we gone too far? Do we have to go back to the basic laws of physics? Well, let me make a start. I think digitalization is something that supports our energy transformation. We're trying to get more from existing infrastructure before being able to build new infrastructure. And we hope this helps us to better understand what happens in the grid and helps us to react better. As we saw in this example, these technologies help us to have the right information at our disposal at the right moment. So I do not see the two as competing. Obviously, we cannot transmit energy through our IT cables, but we are a part of the solution. We're helping make it through the time before we can take the next step.
I can't get rid of them anymore. Is there an imminent risk that, we collect data, we can do more and more things with digitization, Internet of Things, for example. Isn't there an imminent risk that we run into more issues, more problems, also more cases of security breaches?
Yeah, I think so. So there's a big benefit, otherwise we would not go into digitalization. So it brings a lot, but it comes at a cost. And we just have to defend ourselves as good as possible. But some of the gains that we have seen in digitalization efforts are so big, you cannot do without them anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you have seen the light of the art of the possible, of having access to data to improve processes, the cost benefits are so big. So I believe it's a path of no return. We have to continue on digitalization and protect ourselves as good as we can for this malicious sort of attacks.
Wir alle versuchen uns zu schützen im Moment auch vor den.
We all try to protect ourselves as best we can. We try to prepare for the winter. Mr. Kummer, my next question probably doesn't surprise you. SBB is responsible for critical infrastructure. We need you. What are you doing in terms of possible power shortages? What can be done today? How do you prepare? Well, I think all of us can do a lot by not consuming energy now and leaving the water up in the mountains. We can use that energy next year. We had a Corona task force, we had a Ukraine task force, now we have an energy task force. We have a very systematic approach. We have 3 groups of measures. We look at first group of measures are measures that can be implemented by us, measures that are not felt by our customers. We are bringing down temperatures of our buildings. That means in-house. Yes. There are last week, for example, we turned off our huge clock in Wankdorf. That's rather symbolic, but got a lot of intention. Then we have a second train of measures that are measures that would have an impact on our customers, lower temperatures on our trains, lighting, and so forth. And the third group of measures we all hope we do not need to take would be certain trains not running. If we run less trains, we do need less energy. But this would mean the federal government taking certain decisions, Home Office or whatever. SBB is working closely with the industry to prepare, and we hope we never need these measures. What's the worst case if we have a switch off? What does SBB do? Well, I've told you, if we reach that stage, trains stop running. That can't work. We cannot do without the 50 hertz grid for 4 or 5 hours. Well, we all hope we're not going to experience that. Thank you very much for giving us insight into your businesses. I think you deserve a round of applause from our audience.
Ja, und bevor wir weitermachen mit dem
Now, before we continue with the next block, I would like to get back to our illustrator, actually. Let me come over and have a look. What have we done this far, Mr. Studer? He's working, as you can see. I'll try and make sure that everyone can see it. People at home as well. I don't want to go into the details at all. I'm just wondering, how do you do this kind of thing? You start off with a white sheet of paper, and then you have to remember throughout the whole process that you need enough space. You have to include everything. How do you do that? Doesn't that make you nervous? That was a good summary. Well, it's not that I come to these events without having a clue about the topic. I do get all the information that is available beforehand, and then I come up with a concept. Obviously, I don't know in the details what's going to be talked about, but I did have a rough idea before I came here today. And I do have a certain idea about the space I have on the sheet of paper. Well, I'd imagine that you have to be very, very concentrated. You're listening constantly. You include parts of what is being said in your piece of art. And how do you know what is important and what isn't? Well, you have to be a good listener, naturally. Otherwise, you wouldn't work. Sometimes I get into a situation where I realize that I cannot concentrate anymore. So that does happen, yes. And then I have to get myself back to listening again, to wake myself up, so to speak. Yes, it is tough work, actually, physically as well as mentally, so you wouldn't do it every day. So it's kind of sort of meditation as well. So some people came up to you, looked at the chart, and probably remember what was being said in the morning. What kind of a feedback do you get from people looking at your art? Does it help people to process what they've heard? Well, I don't know about the meditation part, but it's definitely added value, absolutely, that you get some sort of a summary, a visual summary of what you've heard. I think that people really like that, appreciate it, and I'm sure that people also have fun looking at it. It's always easier to look at an illustration than having to read up on everything that has been said. So in general, I get positive feedback, I have to say. And people are having fun. Well, I'm sure you're going to get positive feedback today as well, unless you make a big mistake, obviously. I always wonder about that with painters as well. What if after 80% of an image, of a picture of something you've painted, you make a huge mistake? Is that something that you can catch up on? Or, well, luckily I've never done that. It's never happened to me before. Yes, it may happen. For example, for the Trojan horse, I wrote Trojan with a Y rather than a J, as you would in German. But then I can correct it I can white it out and write over it. But big mistakes I really shouldn't make. For example, when I write down the headline, so to speak, of a conference, I always pay extra attention because I wouldn't want to make a mistake there. What do you reckon for this picture? Do you think you're going to fill it up, or are there moments in conferences where you realize, well, I'll have to make bigger pictures now because otherwise I'm not going to cover the space? Well, yes, there are some tricks of how you can fill up space. You make bigger pictures. You write a bit more. Well, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. You're doing a great job. Now, a round of applause for you, even though you haven't quite finished yet.
Ja, und ich kann Sie
Now, let me encourage you to pop by from time to time, maybe have a brief look at what the artist is working on. And I'm sure that at the end, we're going to have another moment to look at it. So Michel has been working the whole day, as we have been. Now we're going to ask you for some more cooperation even. We want to hear your opinion. We're going to do this by Mentimeter. I'm sure you know the tool. And we're going to ask all of you about your opinion on topics that we have talked about and will be talking about later on as well. It's about infrastructure, one of the big topics that Swissgrid is concentrating on as well. And we've got questions that we want to ask you. Head of Grid Infrastructure of Swissgrid, welcome to you. Great, please join me. Herr Hässler, Mr. Hässler, what is it all about? Please tell us. Tell people what's lying ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just very briefly summarize the things we've talked about throughout the day. On the left-hand side, we have policy making. Policies have to create framework conditions for us to do our job, to produce power and electricity. On the very right-hand side, we have those who produce electricity, who build capacity. They do need good and affordable framework conditions to have enough energy at our disposal in the future. And in the middle, we have those operating the grids. As we heard this morning, everyone has his or her role to play, but the overall responsibility is not clear, not in Switzerland and not on EU level either. Let me just briefly summarize again. On the left-hand side, production energy strategy wants to build up 30 gigawatt of photovoltaic in the next years. That's 10 times the output of the Swiss nuclear power plants, which is a major challenge. We're not fast enough, as we've heard. Hydropower is to be increased at the same time. Environmental protection measures are reducing current production levels by 2 to 3 gigawatt. These are terawatt hours being lost. There are certain projects that are currently being blocked, gas-fired power plants as a backup, and nuclear power has a use-by date. We are going to run our nuclear plants as long as it's safe to do so, but we're going to have to replace this energy somehow. Digitalization means consumption is increasing by, we estimate, 20%. E-mobility, building services, computing centers, all do require a lot of energy, do require a lot of power, which means consumption is on the increase. We have two pump storage plants, hydropower plants, who will not save us this winter, but the two plants that started running over the last few years will certainly help us, increase flexibility, help us use the capacities of our grids at best. This is your access code for our Mentimeter. Let me just briefly explain how this works. You probably all know Menti. Please take out your smartphone, log in. We have a QR code, and I think we leave the slide up a little longer. Have you all logged in? Because if you have, we can move on and ask our first question. Looks like you're ready. What do we want to know, Mr. Hassler? We have prepared 4 questions. How can we or should we develop our transmission grid? Currently, it's taking too long. We're moving too slow. What does that mean? Now, 0 means I do not agree at all. 5 means I completely agree. If you give 5 for cables in the ground, then that would give a boost to what we're doing. So first, underground cabling. Second, acceleration of procedures for permissions. Thirdly, reduction of possibilities to oppose projects. And fourth, use of new digital instruments to increase acceptance. Let's hope people at home are also participating. There is a little time lag, so we must make sure we wait every time. We give enough time for people at home to take part. Mr. Hassler, you've said it, a lot has been talked about already today. You're an expert on infrastructure. If you look at all these different issues, people always took these things for granted. You probably did not talk all too much about your job at private occasions. Currently, you're probably asked a lot of questions. Well, 3 years ago, I was asked, where do you work? Swissgrid. People knew Swisscom, Swiss Re, Swiss Life, but did not know Swissgrid. And this development I see as a positive thing. People start thinking about Swissgrid and start thinking about energy. And that brings opportunities. Electricity is less important than air, or has been. If it smells bad, then you notice, but you get electricity from your wall socket. But the situation we're faced with is more dire than the last pandemic. If we have power shortages, the consequences are severe. What is your responsibility? Obviously, you have to communicate. We're talking about a very complex issue. And you have to explain these complex issues to people. It's not always easy. There are certain technical issues, certain physical aspects. Do you think about communication? Yes, of course we do. The projects were where substation projects are easy, but power lines are difficult when it comes to getting planning permission. We have a line that goes across the Brüning Pass, and we're in the first phase now. We want to increase voltage from 220 to 380, and before we start the process, we run events where we invite people, we send letters to those affected. Usually we do involve the canton. There are cantonal plans that are already in place, and obviously there is still going to be opposition, but we try to explain to people that we just do not do these things just for fun, but that we need this grid. Technicians are not always the best at explaining things, but this is something we are working on. 5G is another issue. If it concerns you personally, suddenly you're not as tolerant as you used to be, and that's something very human, I guess. But how do you deal with that? Well, I think, as you say, it's human. We're spoiled, really. In the 50s, people wanted to live close to the motorway, wanted to live close to the airport. Today, this has changed. I think the only solution is to talk to people, to find solutions. Power lines are very complicated. There are all kinds of stakeholders involved, and at some point you have to reach a decision. Talking to people. Let's talk to our audience. I do not see much movement. Let's take a look at the results.
Anschaue, sehen wir das, was sich bereits den ganzen Tag hindurch ein bisschen herauskristallisiert.
If I look at this, I see that the acceleration of approval procedures is something that's important to most people. Does this 4.3 surprise you? No, it doesn't. I would have expected the score to be even higher. With our grid strategy, we again, I'm talking about power lines, not substations, but we have defined certain deadlines. The Gotthard-Grimsel project went quite well, but at the end of the project, the lines were difficult. The Federal Office of Energies sends a group looking at environmental issues, at urban planning, economic aspects, and everybody gets involved, and at the end we come up with a federal solution. But it's still very easy to oppose a project, and that means 2 years being lost in the courts, maybe an additional 2 years when you can go all the way to a federal court, and we do not have that time. We need to move faster. Yes, this is something that's also mentioned under point 3. It takes very few people to block a project. Is the fourth one a surprise to you? Digital instruments. We talked about digitalization. Are we reaching the limits of digitalization? Well, 3.8 is rather high when looking at our projects. We used tools. We worked with the ETH. We tried to do some 3D modeling. the tool tries to find the ideal path for the power lines. And obviously, that does help a little bit, but at the end of the day, we have to build these power lines. That means people putting steel girders together, and that means talking to those concerned. Well, I would have expected a higher score for underground cabling. As a layman, yes, but me as an expert, I would have expected the score to be higher as well. I would have expected underground cabling to be more popular. With every project, we look at whether to at both options, at the underground option and the other one, but the overhead lines are a lot cheaper and are a lot faster to realize. Also, when it comes to operations and maintenance, these overhead lines are easier. We have very little at the moment. We have some projects in our pipeline, but we cannot do this everywhere. There are some areas where you simply cannot go underground. So our future is a hybrid one. Every project has its own idiosyncrasies and needs a bespoke solution. Am I correct? I read somewhere that 2/3 of our existing infrastructure is 25 to 30 years old. Do we have to worry? No, you don't have to worry, but we have to get to work. We have to continue to develop our grid. We have a strategy, Grid 2025. We're currently working on a strategy 2040. We have to bring our lines to the highest voltage, and obviously we need to maintain existing lines and make them fit for the future, and we're working on that to have infrastructure for the future, which brings us to our next panel, where we're talking about the Swissgrid strategy, but we're also going to talk about the grid of the future. Please stay with me. You're part of this panel, and with that, I would like to invite the other panelists to come to the stage. There's only one more panelist from the ETH Zurich, Dr. Yoram Shito, specialist on grid management from the Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. Welcome.
And then we do have a third panelist who would have joined us remotely. However, he's not with us right now. Let's see whether he'll be able to join us later on. I'm not going to tell you yet who it's going to be. It shall be a surprise if he manages to join us after all. Let's start just the three of us. Now, how do we set up the grid of the future? That's a big question we're asking ourselves. We're asking the panel, and I'll start with my first question to both of you. Now, in addition to digitalization, grid expansion is an important success factor for the energy transition. The grid makes a central contribution to achieving the goals of the energy transition. How are we preparing? How are we preparing for this winter, for example? Let's start with you, Mr. Shito, maybe. How are we set up in this regard? Well, the power plants are obviously asked to prepare as well as they can for this winter. For the grid operator, it really depends. They can try to optimize the filling status to be at an optimum level for winter, so the storage and then the gas plants, for example, some of them are part of the grid, but some of them can switch to oil, and they are asked to fill up as well. So fill up their oil tanks in order to make sure that they're prepared for the winter. Pellet heating is another example. You may want to remember already now that you will want to have enough pellets in the winter. Well, it's right now with these temperatures, it's hard to think about this kind of thing, heating, but we really should do it now. Maybe we could switch to more efficient lighting. We at Energy 360 Degrees, we purchased a gas share abroad, but we always depend on what is going to happen abroad as well. And you can look at it from a personal perspective. I'll try to make sure at home, for example, what I can do. I'll make sure that I will use as little energy as I can. I'll reduce the heating, for example, or maybe try to change my diet, for example, using products that are less energy intensive, or remind my children, for example, to switch off the light when they leave the room. Well, switching off the light is one of the things we can do, but do you think people will be prepared to change their diets for this kind of thing? Do you think people even know about that and have enough information? Well, I do think that the knowledge is being spread. Let's think of Christmas and all the cookies and things that we're going to consume then. Yes, people don't know about that yet, but it's always important to know that there is energy in those products as well. What about you, Mr. Hessler? Well, from my perspective, from the Swissgrid's perspective, I completely agree. We need to make sure now that we're prepared for winter. We do have a few projects. One has been approved completely. It was set up for the highest voltage grid, and we had to go through the entire procedure as though we were doing it all afresh. We're talking about Baskow and Mühleberg. We are ready there to increase voltage if needed. We're starting working on that now, and by the end of next year, we should be done with this. So by next winter, we should be able to make the switch to higher voltage in order to be more flexible. And the second project is identical. That's also for the highest voltage level in 22 companies. It seems easy, but it wasn't that easy. There were some oppositions there as well. It's currently blocked with the Federal Administration Court, but we're working together with authorities, with the SFOE, trying to find solution to be better prepared for the winter, to have this grid with more voltage. Now, why is that? We're trying to use hydropower from Valais, which will increase our power, so to speak, and try to transfer that into the cities. But that's not going to happen for this winter, is it? Yes, well, it should. We're working on it. So possibly, as from February, we should have this possibility. And that would be the critical time period, wouldn't it? Yes. So work is being done. And we have been working as well on our connection to the third panelist. I do hope you can hear us and see us, because we can see and hear you. Mr. Christener is with us from Paris right now. Welcome to you, Mr. Christener. You're a member of the board of APG, Austrian Power Grid AG. Yes, thank you very much. I can hear you. Now, you're at an industry congress in Paris. Yes, I'm at Swissgrid. You may know that's one of the biggest congresses with regards to energy systems. And it's highly interesting what we're talking about here. I think that people are very pleased here that it's something that is talked about very widely now. Well, we are very pleased that you managed to join us either way. I wouldn't assume that the discussions are very different in Paris than they are here. Energy crisis, huge topic. How are we going to get through winter? What's your answer to this question? Or for the energy sector in Austria? Well, as far as I know, you've already talked about this before. We see three big topics in Austria. In Austria, we have a net import in Austria, which is quite similar to Switzerland, with regards to hydropower, etc. It really depends on that. We rely on our gas-fired power plants. 80% of the gas is sourced in Russia for Austria, which makes it all very difficult. However, on the bonus side, we have large storage volumes, 100 terawatt hours, and that's the requirement of gas in Austria. So right now, we're trying to tap different sources, and we also tap into the storage in order to improve our supply security. The question beyond this is, what can we do on the market? Will the market still work? We don't know what lies in store for us in the next few days and weeks, so we are worried. The whole situation in Europe is a big topic here in Paris. You might know about that, France and Italy. There isn't a lot of water currently, and the insecurity with regards to nuclear power plants adds to this. That could have a great impact on the rest of Europe as well. So in sum, it's a very insecure situation right now. A situation that is being discussed in a very, in a neutral way as possible way here, trying to find solution. Maybe more specifically, you have been talking about the market. The Austrian Federal Chancellor talked about this today. Mr. Ehammer talked about some craziness, if I'm not wrong. He's talking about the prices that we're seeing right now, especially with regards to energy. He talked about some capping. How realistic is that? Well, on the one hand side, we are talking about a capping for electricity prices in Austria. We want to couple that with a specific amount of being used, maybe 3.5 kilowatt hours, which is the use of a classic household. So there would be a cap there. And anything going beyond that, the consumer would have to purchase in addition. So that would at least help people to get through winter, especially groups who aren't financially well off. And all of those who need electricity going beyond this, they could make additional purchases. This would have to be financed, however, with funds provided by the government. And the second project would be a coupling between gas, so gas-fired power plants or thermal power plants, and others. So that would be one of the goals. What method we are going to use, or whether it will be the Spanish method with some capping there as well, or some energy saving, or maybe the Greek solution, etc. I think this is something that we are going to talk about in September, also depending on what the EU decides. Energy prices in Austria are at a level which is at average, the European average. However, the Austrian economy is suffering. So we can tell that these topics are intensely discussed in different countries, in all the European countries. Now let's get back to the grid of the future. Now, Mr. Schieter, we're in this split situation. We want to work on the future. However, the processes are very slow and complicated. Do you see a solution in this regard? Or are we just going to have to live with it if there aren't any more incentives? Well, digitalization is definitely going to help speed things up. We also need to raise awareness, obviously, that it's high time. And yes, at the end of the day, we have to balance the interests. With regards to PV, how important is the image or the beautiful landscape if we weigh it out with the interests of the community? This is something that could be sped up, these processes. Or we could take political steps, supporting initiatives, increasing the speed of expanding renewables, etc. Well, this also has to do with the current situation. However, the energy transition is still one of our goals. That's another thing that we'll have to consider. How can it be considered in this discussion? Well, we do have the Energy Perspective 2025. We have our climate goals that we want to reach, and they go hand in hand. If we all stick together, if we keep on reminding ourselves what we want to do with the energy transition and how we want to come it about. Currently, we're focusing on electrification. We have approximately 40,000 new e-vehicles per year, and it's going to increase by approximately 25. So it's going to be 25% of the energy or the electricity consumed by 2040, presumed. Now we should really ask ourselves how efficient this really is, because electricity offered in winter, there is a big question mark there. Will the electricity always come from renewable energy sources? One solution would be to take the electricity produced in summer, be turned into something that can be stored, storing it in order to be able to provide it in winter. So we'll have to take a step back and find the overarching goals and overarching solutions. But Switzerland wants to be climate neutral, so net zero, that's the goal. That's a topic that is being discussed in Austria as well, and all countries have their goals. They've set them down in paper. However, we're currently still very dependent on Russian gas, especially Austria, and you're closer geographically also when it comes to the war. Now, what's the impact of this on the discussion on the energy transmission? Are there voices saying that we should just try and deal with the next 2 or 3 years before we concentrate on any goals we might have at 2030, 2040, 2050? Or is that something that can be coupled? Well, I'd have to say in the last few months and weeks and months, things have undergone some change in Austria. We have a government, including the Green Party, who have been asking for the energy transition for years now. And it has become the big goal to be 100% renewable by 2030 and to be climate neutral by 2040. So these are the two big goals, and they were communicated at the beginning of this legislation. The Green Minister, however, now had to revitalize an old coal power plant. So yes, we are in quite an embarrassing, you could say, situation right now to wonder about how we can overcome or how we can go through the upcoming winter. So we're currently doing crisis management in Austria as well as in other countries. On the other hand, we've realized a few things. We always warned of that, we from APG. The grid that we have right now is not the system which is going to work with 100% renewables. It's not going to be safe anymore. We always said that we cannot just switch off the thermal power plants tomorrow, but we have to set up an energy system which is balanced. And we're still quite far off there. We don't have the storage capacities required for this, so this is a big topic in Austria as well. Since we're still net importers, how are we going to concentrate on, for example, hydropower, etc.? So many of these questions are being asked right now. However, as you said yourself, currently we're working in a crisis management mode. So we're tapping all the sources that are still available in Austria. So with regards to the war, that's going to change the next few weeks and months, definitely. However, that doesn't mean that we can forgo planning for the future. There is a question with regards to the insecurities and the expansion of production capacities. Is Swissgrid actually able to seriously plan a renewable network and renewable grid? Yes, well, I do think we can. It might be difficult to understand for those who aren't close enough. There are different scenarios that are discussed right now for 2040, which are underlying for 2050 as well, including Europe and the EU. And with this framework, as well as the prognosis can be done right now, we need to make decisions and then carry on. Yes, we do infrastructure, we need expansion, we need enormous amounts. And if this framework is being accepted by the Federal Council, Swissgrid has 9 months' time, and we will set up a model. We're going to talk with the industry with regard to that as well. It's not something that we invent just for ourselves. Everyone is in the same boat. And then we're going to make calculations and see where we need some support, higher voltages. So we're always going to try and build on the existing infrastructure before we start something afresh. And then Elcom will look at it after the 9 months, and that will take us another step ahead. And the plan is to look at it every 4 years and to readapt to the current situation. Right now it's going to take a while, but then in the future it should be accelerated as a process in general. The load flows presumably are not going to change much in the future. Shortages are going to be felt in the future as well at around the same time of the year. So I'm pretty confident that we're not building on a sand ground here. There are always going to have to be some adjustments. And I want to add to what Mr. Schitter said before. We should not do one thing but not the other, but we have to try and to include all the parameters. And there shouldn't be any fundamental wars about whether technology is good or bad or anything like this. And with regard to the digitalization, there is great hope there as well. For example, for decentralized production and decentralized use, for example, with PV on your roof or with an e-vehicle, etc., or with a vehicle that can be used for production as well. that's always going to relieve the entire system. You've mentioned PV. One of the big topics was how can we foster this? Why isn't it accelerating more than it is right now? Now, Mr. Scheiter, why is the expansion so difficult to predict? It's a good question. The problems are manifold. Now, if you look at it from a technical, logistical perspective, there is currently great demand, but very little offer. Secondly, we're lacking experts, installation planners, PV experts, etc. And there is a problem with supply, delivery, with silicon cells, etc. And the second problem is a legal problem. The approval takes a long time and is very complicated, and many proceedings are opposed to, and that will take even longer then. And this is where it takes us back to approval procedures. I think with regards to PV, they could be increased or sped up. And thirdly, there is willingness to put a PV installation on your roof, but often there isn't enough capital, not enough investment capital. And you also need to be able to actually use the electricity that you produce. So what we need there is more support by planners. They need to come up with solutions as to what to do with the electricity that is gained. Our planners are working on such concepts for the electricity required for pumps, etc., for those to be covered with PV installations. Something Mr. Hasler mentioned, you're very good at giving me buzzwords to use. Centralized or decentralized, a question to Paris. What do you think makes more sense? I do think that we're going to have both in the future. We wouldn't be able to say that we're going to completely replace the centralized system that has been set up historically over many years. We're not going to completely replace that. Decentralized, many people think that's very individualized. That's not what I think. This is something that should probably be explained a bit more in detail in the future, because I think that, for example, in Austria, we have energy communities. They're being supported and fostered and boosted. So within the communities, there are groups who are using PV, storage solutions, e-mobility, etc. However, it's more a marketing measure, because the electricity is going to continue to flow in the grid, and people will want to participate in the grid. The client will presumably become more of an active player in the future with their PV installations. I could imagine one or two things that could be happening there or should be happening there. However, on the other hand, I wouldn't want to be the manager of my system on a daily basis, so that the clients probably would want to be integrated in the electricity system. But so they would want to provide it as a service as well, but everything should be automated. They shouldn't be the managers of that. And that is going to be required in order to even take advantage of these systems. We can see now in Austria there is an area with approximately 300 megawatt load, and they are trying to be self-sufficient. The politicians in the area, they're praising themselves. However, at the same time, they're asking for help and subsidies in order to make sure to get rid of the surplus electricity they produce. So this is what I mean if I talk about management as well. So yes, it does help to have these decentralized management entities, but it's not going to be the sole solution. Now, before you leave us, let me ask a question, since we have a panelist here from the European Union. We've been talking about the difficult relationship Switzerland has with the European Union, and we've had representatives from Italy and Estonia as well. What is your point of view? How can we achieve an agreement? What is Austria's position in this conflict? Now, with all the hope I can put in this question, will Austria help us? Well, firstly, I think the relationship between Austria and Switzerland were always excellent. At least that's what I felt. And I'm sure that's always going to be true for our relationship with Swissgrid as well. And we can tell that Mr. Zumwalt and other Swiss representatives are tirelessly working on improving relationships and to stressing capacity questions and the contribution that Switzerland can make. And that's very good, I have to say. And thirdly, I have to say, yes, it's a shame for us as well. Switzerland is an important player. We cannot circumvent Switzerland, so to speak. So it is important to us as well to include Switzerland in our projects with regard to market coupling, to grid coupling, to integration of the systems. Switzerland has to be part of it, otherwise the system won't work. Thank you very much. Maybe we'll continue with the same question in a panel. Mr. Scheiter, you're not a politician, you might not be able to predict what the future is going to look like. However, still the question, are we even going to be able to move ahead as long as this question isn't dealt with? Well, you're absolutely right. Switzerland depends on the surrounding countries. It depends on what is going to happen politically, but also it depends on the amounts that are available, what routes are available via which the electricity can come to Switzerland. We're not an island. But as you said as well, there is hope. Thanks to the expansion of renewable energies, we could become more self-sufficient. Maybe not at 100%, but maybe we will manage to stock up. Maybe we'll manage to stock up on energies that can be used at the right time. We can foster innovation in Switzerland. We have a lot of innovation in Switzerland. We do have specialists, but we do need more specialists. And this international cooperation that you've mentioned, it has been working really well thus far, and we do hope that we can count on that during the winter. If there is going to be a shortage, possible shortage, we shouldn't take this for granted. Adrian Hessler, a very specific question at the end. So we've got this energetic situation as it is right now, but because of other issues, we have supply shortages that we need to deal with. I've heard that there is a lack of cables, a lack of small components. Is that a problem for Swissgrid as well? Well, at least for now, touch wood, we still have everything that we need available. However, with regards to IT, despite the fact that we try to have most of the parts in stock, there might be some shortages there. We did go and visit the suppliers in autumn last year in order to check their situation, especially with regards to steel. We have a big project in Engadina. We were able to obtain everything we needed in time, but it was a huge project. And if we look ahead into the future, we've got big transformers where we need a lot of material. And we just try to initiate projects earlier on in order to make sure that we have reserves. It's working currently, but it's a permanent challenge. And yet another challenge, as though there weren't enough already. I hope you're going to be resilient throughout this time, and thank you very much for being here, part of this panel. Also to you, Mr. Christinger, to Paris, thank you very much for joining us. A big hand for everyone to hear in Paris even. Thank you.
Ja, wir machen nahtlos weiter. Mögen Sie noch?
You still with us? A very enthusiastic nod I saw there. I hope people at home showed the same reaction. One more panel awaits us. We talked about shortages. We talked about energy shortages and power shortages, but there are other kinds of shortages. There is a lack of skilled workers, a lack of experts. We need new talent, we need new skills in today's world, which obviously puts the HR departments to a difficult task. They have to make their businesses and their industries attractive. What does your industry do to attract talent? War for talent it has been called war for talent, and as employers, people try to attract the best talent. This is one side of the coin. The other part of the question is, what does the industry need to be fit for the future? And I'm going to discuss these questions with our next panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Doris Barnett, CFO of Swissgrid, Dr. Michel Etienne, a partner of Innopool, strategy consultancy business, and last but not least, Professor Dr. Gabriela Hug, professor at ETH Zurich. Welcome.
In meiner Branche nennt man diesen Slot so ein bisschen the graveyard shift.
In my industry, we call this slot the graveyard shift. It's not easy to stand on the last panel of a lot day, but I'm sure we're going to do our job, and we're going to do it well. Before we start, let's take a look at a Swissgrid video that shows us how you work. It contains some testimonials that explain why people are working for Swissgrid. Let's take a brief look. Well, I would tell my child to stay curious, to keep in touch with people, do something that you like. Go and come to work for Swissgrid. What I like about Swissgrid is that people are given a lot of responsibilities. I like
die Talente zu identifizieren und sie dann auch entsprechend zu fördern. Also ich erlebe es so, dass bei Swissgrid alle gleichgestellt sind. Im Sinne von, wenn jemand die fachlichen Anforderungen erfüllt, dann kommt es mir auf die Persönlichkeit drauf an von dieser Person. Und was ich sehr positiv finde, ist, dass wir doch einige Leute in Führungspositionen haben, die Teilzeit arbeiten. Und zwar Frauen und Männer. Ich finde es toll, dass ich bei Swissgrid 80% arbeite für meine...
For me, it's great to work 80%. I'm able to work in my home office. We have flexible working hours. It's important for me to enjoy what I do day in, day out. Personal development is important for me. Good atmosphere at work. It's interesting, it's challenging. I have good relationship with my colleagues. I like to face new challenges every day. We have a lot of incredibly smart people working for us. I learn something new every day. What I like about Swissgrid is the support I receive for my professional development. We receive a lot of training, and all leaders have undergone diversity training. I can work on my French. If I have to describe Swissgrid in one word, I would say multicultural, dynamic, complex, reliable. Networks, reliable.
Ja, ein fröhliches Arbeitsumfeld. Was wünscht man sich mehr?
Seems to be a great place to work. What did you notice? Only women. Obviously, this is something we will talk about. Before we get started with the discussion, let me ask you a basic question. Attracting talent has not got easier. We have to manage the energy transition in ecological and economic terms. What role do employees play? Well, as you've seen in the video, all our employees make a contribution to the energy transition. We are building the grid of the future. We're building a grid for renewable energies. We're building a reliable transmission grid. Building this transmission grid, running and operating this transition grid needs stable conditions, and key to everything are our people. Without an ambitious workforce, we cannot make any progress. We need innovative people. We need people who are willing to make a contribution. We, as an employer, provide a platform. We can help with personal development and training. We can create an environment for flexible work. There is a lot of mutual respect at Swissgrid, and everyone is giving his and her best every day, focusing on the human factor. You're looking for people to position them in your businesses, in your industry. In technical fields, people tend to focus on technological issues rather than on human issues. How important are people really? Well, you talked about the graveyard shift. I would like to pick up on that. If we forget about the human factor, that becomes our graveyard. If we cannot, there's huge demand and we need people. My main industry is the health industry, but there are a lot of similarities. We not only lack IT specialists and engineers, we also need health professionals, and everybody keeps telling us how important these fields are. But this has not arrived at the ears of all decision makers yet. And you notice that in your daily work? Yes, I do. At the end of the day, it also comes down to fundamental values. It comes down to your social background. A lot of decision makers work 100%, have a wife at home doing all the work at home. The younger generation wants to work differently, wants to work part-time, wants to have a career, but not at any price. And young people can choose where they work. You work in a lab for electric energy transmission at ETH Zurich. That's a very technical field. How important is the human factor in your lab, Professor Dr. Hook? Well, obviously it is important. In my team, I need to create a motivating environment. It's important for my collaborators to feel they can make a difference. They need to be able to develop their ideas. They need to feel heard. And when it comes to the energy strategy and comes to implementing it, it's important that not only in our universities, but also in our utility companies, we have people who are able to, who have ideas and try them out. We heard from the company's side that the young generation gets to choose where and how they want to work. Is that the same in academia? Is the next, or has the next generation become more demanding? And does it ask questions that haven't been asked so far? It's difficult to answer your questions. I see students at the start of their career. And in my team, we have very few locals. We have very few Swiss people who want to take that step, who want to obtain a PhD, and maybe that's due to the manifold opportunities they have. Some people get a bachelor degree and then undergo vocational training. Maybe I'm the wrong person to address this question to, because I see people at the beginning of their career. When you talk to HR, you often hear that a business has very specific demands, that companies need certain skills. At the same time, the young generation wants purpose, wants to identify with their employer. Is it difficult to provide that as an employer and as a business, and not only on paper, but on the job as well? Well, as we've heard today, we need electricity. Without electricity, there is no wealth. It's about our quality of life, and we know about our role in this respect. We know how important we are for Switzerland, and we started communicating this. We started communicating what we do for people and for the environment. We're very active on social media to reach the young generation. Let's talk about employer branding. It was important to us to give our employees the opportunity to present their work and their workplace, because they are our best ambassadors. We do more. We conduct internal and external trainings. People are able to work part-time to accommodate the different life plans that the next generation might have. Individual opportunities are important for the individual employees. We are very diverse business. People from 28 nations are working in our company. We try to increase diversity in our teams. We see this as an opportunity to be successful in the future. Diversity is important also when looking for a job. Corporate values are another issue. Are there other points of focus? Has there been a change when looking back 10 to 15 years? Well, work-life balance, work-life blending are buzzwords. Work-life separation is something that's being demanded by the next generation. No emails after 5 and no emails on weekends. There's a new trend. People only do what they're being employed for. A lot of people are not prepared to go the extra mile. But obviously, if you have to distinguish here. If you go to the ETH, if you want to obtain a PhD, you are a high potential candidate. And for these people, career is important, has a value. Obviously, diversity is important. The reputation of your company is important, but career is important. People are always looking for role models in life and at work. The question is, how can you implement diversity in academia? Equal representation has not been reached yet. Women are still underrepresented when it comes to MINT subjects. How do you address this? Well, I am very proud. My team is 50% female. 10 of 20 on average are women. How did you manage? Well, it was a conscious choice. I approached women who came to my lectures in particular and asked them, maybe you want to think about a PhD? And men might have been thinking about this anyway, and these women were often less confident, and I motivated them to choose that path. That's one side of it. You also mentioned the pipeline problem. The higher you go up in the hierarchy, the less women you find. And obviously, if you're looking for a new professorship, you do not have all too many women candidates. So it's important to support candidates early on. It's important to address this at school. It's important also to address work-life balance. I went to an event yesterday where we tried to show girls that it's possible to have a career and a family. And then it's important to provide the right working environment. I am very flexible. A lot of my staff had children, and I said, okay, your child is ill. Well, let's talk next week, or bring it along, or whatever. I try to find individual solutions. This is something that's most certainly important for the next generation of employees. You also mentioned something that I found interesting. There is a gap between our goals and the reality. Diversity is necessary to attract the right talent, but is that something that has not been understood by all? Who's to blame? Is it the older generation? Do they not recognize the importance of the issue? Where do we have most catching up to do? Any recommendations? Well, if I look at the audience, I see only men, and yet I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I discuss a lot with my husband. We have a company together. He sits on boards, I sit on boards, and he says, you wouldn't believe how people talk about women. And yes, companies want to be diverse. It helps overcome the shortage of workers, and I'm not only talking about gender diversity, I'm also talking about different life plans, I'm talking about part-time opportunities. But at the same time, it gets narrower at the top, and the more women start playing the game, the harder the competition gets for the highest seats. And a lot of men are saying, well, as a male, I do not stand a chance to run for CEO, to run for a leadership position. And that obviously creates fear. The world is changing, and some people find it difficult to adapt. And I think, yes, people want to see change as long as they're not concerned. And then some people are bellwethers, other people sit back and watch, and some people want the old world order back. It's not the same for everyone. Well, but what's your answer if gender diversity starts being called gender madness, if LGBTQ issues are being addressed, people start saying, well, do we really have to talk about this as well? I think a lot of awareness raising still needs to happen. Yes, I think you need to find allies. If you find someone who is interested, you can make him or her an ambassador. You can be a role model. You're able to quote surveys and studies. If you look at the figures being reported, there are a lot of businesses that have growth potential but cannot grow because they do not have the people. And the Swiss culture is to focus on the bottom line, and I think that's where you get people, financial incentives. Sometimes you cannot get someone to fill a vacancy, and maybe that's when people wake up. How about Swissgrid? Are you open to different models and plans of life? It's about who you love, but also who you are. People are discussing gender in a way they did not discuss it in the past. As a leader, how do you address these issues? Well, we want to be a diverse and inclusive business. We discuss this on a regular basis because we see major opportunities for the future. I think our society is changing, and we need to accept that our society is changing. We need new and more flexible options for people. A question was asked about Fridays for Future. A lot of young people got together. Obviously, that has an impact on the work environment. The question goes to Ms. Etienne. Are there any strategies to integrate these climate activists in today's business world? How can businesses and companies benefit from these new movements and ideas? Well, you can make them ambassadors. New instruments to attract talent have been discussed and are important. Social media. There are some health institutions that use TikTok as a channel to apply for a job. Purpose is something that's very important to young people. It's also about doing what you say. It's about walking the talk. People do notice if you don't do that. And when talking about the energy industry, you can use that. You can use these young people to work on sustainability concepts. And they realize if I demonstrate, I am heard, but I am not sure anything will happen. But if you integrate them and if you show them, if you work for us, we're going to give you a space where you can make a difference, where you can change something, I think this is an opportunity. It sounds easy, it sounds fantastic to integrate these young people. Anyone working with young people, anyone working as in some kind of leadership position knows what I'm talking about. 15 years ago, you said we do it like this, and it was done like this. Today, people ask back, why? It has become difficult to lead. How do you walk this line? How do you strike this balance? You also have to do your real work. You also have to do your research. Well, I'm very fortunate. I have a very motivated team. My PhD students are highly motivated. They all want to work. Yes, I have to tell them I don't expect you to do that on a Saturday or on a Sunday. I am fortunate in this respect. I work with highly motivated people. There is an opportunity to attract new people on the sustainability ticket. This is something that's important to the young generation, and I think this is an opportunity for us to tell people, hey, this could be an option for you to make a career, and that could help us to attract talent. Sometimes the generation is called the entitlement generation. You can choose where you work. The war for talent is a reality. How do you address this? Because at the end of the day, there are certain things that need doing. Is there a risk? Well, when I am involved in decision-making processes, I see processes being relaunched because no suitable candidate could be found because the respective expectations do not match. It's good if you can afford that. Sometimes there is a jump out of the box solution. New brooms, as we say in Bern, are more efficient, and sometimes what I just described means that someone gets an opportunity that was not considered beforehand, and it makes businesses more flexible. They say we're paying a high wage, the process is costing a lot of money, the initial training is costing a lot of money, and if we're not 100% happy, maybe let's rethink our structures. If you can afford that, that's fantastic. If you can't afford that, you take the last remaining candidate and you find a way to keep going. That almost concludes our panel. One brief look at the future. During the pandemic, we were all confronted with new ways of working. We all had to work from home. How about Swissgrid? Has your working environment changed? And is that going to continue? Maybe your employee of the future works from home? Well, it's true what you are saying. The way we work has changed dramatically. During COVID, we worked in home office for several months, and I'm very proud of what our employees have done during that time. I think in the future there will be a mix. There are different expectations. Some people like working in the office, other people like working from home. Well, from what I've heard and read, the young generation likes coming to the office because they like starting in the morning, finishing at night, and being done with work. The now 30-year-olds like staying at home. They're the ones dialing in from home, so to speak. Are you ready for them? Yes, we are ready. We said we accept 50% of work being done from home. Obviously, that depends on the line manager and on the function. And depending on expectations, we will see how things develop. What's your perception? Well, I see a shift back to the office. I have heard also people saying, well, if you want a career, you must meet some people sometimes. And the businesses I have talked to tend to want to have people in the office at least 50-60% of the time. And if they need some private space, they can do some of their job from home. Ms. Hoog, if you were allowed to make a wish, you talk to the industry, you talk to businesses, and you work with young students. What would you wish for? What do you want businesses to give to these young people? Well, I hope for all my students that they'll shall find a job that gives them fulfillment. And I would want businesses to offer interesting job opportunities. And I think the energy transition has a lot of interesting questions that need addressing. So that's a good basis. But yes, hybrid modes of working, part-time at the office, to create networks, to start collaboration, to exchange ideas, with a certain part of the work being done at home. I think these flexible models allow you to attract people who want to work in a flexible manner. Home office allows me to spend more time with my family to help out, and I think a balance needs to be struck here, and that in turn helps you keep your staff motivated. So you see these changes as an opportunity and as a positive change. Fantastic. I managed to finish on a positive note. Thank you very much for the insights. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Vielen Dank. Ich lasse Sie die Bühne.
Thank you very much. I'll let you leave the stage, and I'll ask somebody to join me up here again. Or is Derek? He's going to conclude to this day. Yes, well, I'll probably not do it as well as a professional as yourself. Thank you very much for your work. That was impressive and quite the performance for hours on end. We do have a present for you as well. This might be good for your preparation for winter. Well, there is a torch. I've heard about this one. And I think there is even a power bank. Exactly. For a good winter to be had. Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the next Grid Forum. And I would like to make a few brief comments here to conclude this meeting. I do have one question for the audience here. What do you need critically in order to prepare for an energy crisis in the winter or an energy shortage in the winter?
Ein Wasserfilter, vergessen Sie das nicht.
Water filters, please don't forget about them, because drinking water is even more important for the human being than electricity. I cannot plug myself into the socket, but I will need a drink of water from time to time. And then in Italian is... It's not very easy for me to speak Italian, but I do know that there are some Italian speakers here from the Ticino, and I'm very appreciative that they have come here. I do hope that in the future it will be possible to have an Italian presentation as well, just to make sure that we don't forget that we're a national grid company. So it's not only German and French, but also Italian speaking here. Mark, are you still here?
He's awake. Good. So that gives me an opportunity.
He's awake. That's great.
The presenters who came from abroad, very much appreciated to have a different point of view, different insights, global insights. I think it's given us some ideas that we can work on in the future. And we certainly hope to have people of your caliber available again for the next round. And I'm still waiting for the confrontational statement, but maybe it'll happen during the aperitif, which is, of course, a good place to be slightly confrontational if you wish to do so. Und damit würde ich dann wirklich auch nicht länger...
And this is where I would like to actually conclude. Thank you very much for being here. It was a long day, and all of us, we deserve a drink now. And then finally, thank you very much to the organizational team from Swissgrid, from Verkehrshaus. And maybe we'll get a brief look at the piece of art that was made during the day today. Let's see whether the camera can give us a glimpse. That should work. Here we go. It's complete. Well, there is too much on there in order to go into the details, but thank you very much, Michel, for your work. And as I said before, let's have drinks now. Have a safe trip home and see you again next year.